The chilling opening scene. I can still recall that singular moment when I first stumbled upon the story of a serial killer who came to embody the darkest fears haunting American society. It began not with blood or sirens, but with a grainy black and white photo in an archived news article, an image of a hand, fingers unnaturally long and slender, almost skeletal, holding up an evidence card at a police press conference. That hand, so devoid of warmth, seemed to cradle the secrets of countless unspeakable crimes. People in New York whispered about the shadowy figure behind those monstrous acts. Maybe you have at some point caught wind of the chilling nicknames associated with him. He was known on the streets and in headlines as the Rat Man, Red Shadow, the Little Girl Killer, but his most infamous alias was the Otaku Butcher. Each one sent a shiver down the collective spine of every neighborhood across the city. But why so many pseudonyms? How could a single person accrue such a dark legend in the American criminal psyche? The late 80s in New York were no strangers to violence, but these murders were different, uniquely cruel, methodical, profoundly disturbing. As media and police dug deeper into a series of shocking disappearances, especially of young girls, details of the atrocities committed began to surface. The killer was elusive, mocking law enforcement with letters and cryptic messages mailed directly to both police precincts and the families of victims, instigating a citywide frenzy. Families kept their children close. Headlines screamed warnings. Rumors swirled of a monster hiding among the ordinary, invisible by day, overtaken by his grotesque urges by night. Back then, I was just an observer, reading headline after headline, piecing together the grim saga unfolding with every breaking news alert. He never struck twice at the same place, and every new lead only seemed to deepen his legend and the helplessness of the entire city. What made things worse was the sense that he was always one step ahead. He seemed to watch from the shadows, anticipating every move, relishing the attention and playing a sick game that only he understood the rules of. Sometimes I wonder what it felt like to be part of that city, cloaked in dread, waiting for the next tragedy, questioning every neighbor, every nighttime figure. Manhattan's glittering lights seemed dimmer, the parks emptier, silence charged with unease. Living through that era meant breathing the same air as evil and never knowing if you could spot its presence until it was too late. Looking back, that opening scene, an unsettlingly lifeless hand, a city in terror, the birth of America's modern boogeyman, still haunts me. It was the start of one of the most infamous criminal sagas the country had ever witnessed, and for many, it was the moment innocence truly died. New York City, 1988, where the darkness took root. The summer of 1988 in New York City was one of paradoxes, a place bursting at the seams with ambition, culture, and vibrancy. Yet underneath every celebration, there pulsed an undercurrent of unease. At first glance the city thrived. Times Square glittering with neon, Central Park crowded with laughter, Wall Street bustling with ceaseless energy. But late that summer, all of it began to warp as a string of child disappearances crept insidiously into the headlines. Every boulevard and brownstone which had once offered a promise of possibility took on a different flavor, one that tasted of apprehension and dread. You could feel it just stepping out onto the sidewalks. Parents who'd once ushered their kids down city blocks now gripped their hands so tightly the mornings became silent walks of tension rather than carefree explorations. Restaurant chatter and subway conversations always drifted back to the same topic. Another child gone, another face on a missing poster fluttering in the humid wind. Descriptions of the vanished were so heartbreakingly similar, innocent, joyful, brimming with potential, it felt like the attacker was extracting hope itself from the city's veins. Police sirens, already a normal backdrop for urban life, now carried an extra sting. Each time they blared, mothers and fathers across Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Manhattan would wonder, is it another one? The NYPD, battered by media criticism and infighting, established special task forces, but it seemed disaster always broke just before these squads could catch up. News crews prowled neighborhoods, cornering grieving parents for desperate soundbites, while fearmongers turned every shadow into a suspect. Old prejudices resurfaced, neighbors viewed each other with suspicion, and community meetings grew heated as anxiety boiled just beneath the surface. Despite its formidable size, the city suddenly felt like a small locked room. No one could leave and no one was truly safe. Supermarkets, schools, apartment complexes, everywhere there were flyers, whispered warnings, curtains drawn a little tighter. Don't talk to strangers, every child was told, but the enemy seemed less a person and more an invisible force. Local newspapers dubbed the criminal the Night Phantom before the now infamous aliases took over, and some journalists even speculated about a group behind the crimes. All the while, true crime junkies and city dwellers alike speculated over motives and patterns late into the night. What struck me most, though, was the relentless way hope shrank. New York had always been a city that bounced back. After all, it had survived blackouts, mafia wars, and economic collapse. But this time, something intangible died. The streets seemed to lose color, the laughter evaporated from playgrounds, and the communal resilience was replaced by the gnawing acceptance that some evils couldn't be shut out with locks or alarms. So there I was, just one more New Yorker living through the first chapter of a horror story written in real time. Everyone waited, almost breathlessly, for a break in the case or some return to normalcy. But each day, the city's shadow grew longer. The anticipation of the unknown, of a darkness that for once might never fully be explained, haunted New York. Looking back, 1988 wasn't just the year a killer struck, it was the year trust itself started to bleed away, and fear took a permanent hold in the city's soul. Unforeseen cracks in paradise. From the outside looking in, Aaron and Denise truly seemed to have stumbled upon the formula for the perfect romance. Their laughter was easy, their ambitions aligned, and family gatherings were filled with inside jokes, teasing, and the type of warm bickering that aged couples exhibit. But even the most luminous California sunlight couldn't conceal every shadow beneath the surface. The first crack in their golden veneer revealed itself on an ordinary evening, when Denise, half curious, half playful, glanced at Aaron's phone as it vibrated on the kitchen counter. She wasn't a naturally suspicious person, but something about the unfamiliar notification pried at the corners of her peace. What she found was jarring, a string of messages between Aaron and his ex-fiancée. Buried in that digital conversation was a message that wasn't just a mundane catch-up, but instead laced with longing, a question, a hope, wishing for a second chance. Denise's heart twisted in her chest. Up until this moment, she had believed with near religious certainty that Aaron's past was precisely where it belonged. Behind them, a mere shadow in the rear view. The revelation felt like a betrayal, not just of trust, but of the optimism that had glued their young love together. It wasn't the existence of a former flame. Life, after all, is complex, and everyone arrives with some baggage. It was the secrecy, the ongoing dialogue, and that tortured plea for reconciliation. They argued, voices reverberating off drywall, the kind of fight that flips a page in any relationship. Words bristled with anger and pain. Aaron, blindsided, stumbled through apologies and promises. He insisted he'd never intended to hurt Denise, that contacting his ex was a mistake born of unresolved feelings and a restless heart knowing he'd ruined something before. Denise, proud and aching, drew a line in their story. She needed space, solitude, and for the first time in their shared memory, chose to sleep elsewhere. Days spilled into a silent standoff, with neither willing to blink first, the silence louder than shouts. But love, or maybe longing, has a way of pulling the wounded back together. Each tried to fill the growing void with work, friends, and the routines of adulthood, but every text left unsent, every shared meme left untagged, felt like an open wound. Friends on both sides urged reconciliation. No one's perfect, you know, maybe you both needed this wake-up call. After days of icy radio silence, it was Aaron who first attempted to bridge the gap. One tentative late-night text, a modern olive branch. Denise's heart thundered. Logic sparred with emotion as she considered the messages, replayed their arguments, and weighed what she would lose by letting him go forever. Eventually, through a haze of uncertainty, she answered. There was an unspoken agreement that forgiveness isn't a single moment, but a process. A decision renewed over and over through trust rebuilt, apology reoffered, and routine rediscovered. They tiptoed back into the fragile warmth of each other's lives, determined, or perhaps just hopeful, that this blemish would fade with time. Yet the memory of that secret message lingered, not quite healed, always there, waiting, like a tiny fault under the surface, for its next aftershock. Fractures in a privileged childhood. From the outside, Mark Hamilton's youth was a carefully curated tableau of privilege and opportunity. But on the inside, invisible fissures began to spiderweb as he edged into adolescence. While his early childhood passed in the tailored jackets and polished shoes of private school corridors, and always under the watchful scrutiny of a family intent on producing nothing short of brilliance, Mark felt increasingly alienated. The very same long, spidery fingers that made piano teachers swoon over potential actually became the silent trigger for his self-loathing. Whispered teases in locker rooms, playground stares, the occasional cruel note tucked into his desk, all compounded his quiet belief that he was, at his core, defective. At home, the temperature dropped further. Each academic accolade only raised the stakes, and the lavish birthday parties, the trips to Cape Cod, these felt less like celebrations and more like public demonstrations of Hamilton family success. Charles and Evelyn, his parents, quizzed him over breakfast about Latin roots and Wall Street, never about his dreams or everyday musings. The more Mark's grades became the focus of dinner conversations, the less he wanted to try. Excellence, once a source of pride, now pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. But loneliness breeds defense mechanisms. Mark learned to blend, to go silent, to keep his feelings tightly guarded and leak them only into the margins of his sketchbooks or the quiet corners of the estate. As puberty arrived, Mark's insecurities calcified. He grew introverted to the point of social paralysis, save for brief, awkward attempts at friendship that fizzled under the weight of his awkwardness and peculiarity. No matter how many blazers he wore, he couldn't shake the sense that he was only ever pretending. The pride his parents wished for curdled inside him into envy and resentment, toward classmates who seemed to pass through life so easily, toward a family lineage he could never embody. But the real shock came when Harvard, the inevitable destination mapped out for him since preschool, handed down a rejection. The Hamiltons did their best to spin the failure, but behind closed doors, the air grew thick with bitter silence and disappointment. Mark's sense of self-worth, already brittle, outright fractured. He started skipping classes, isolating himself for hours at a time, and his behavior, once only peculiar, grew erratic and secretive. His parents, unaccustomed to anything less than perfection, met this with more lectures. Mark, for his part, stopped trying to meet their gaze at all. He wasn't the golden son anymore, just a paper cutout, fading quietly into the edges of family photographs. Looking back, it's obvious that this period was the tectonic shift in Mark's psyche. Every fracture, big and small, became the fault line along which darker forces would one day surge. These weren't the scars of physical violence, but the slow, inexorable bruising of the soul, layer by layer, year after lonely year. Art school and the descent into depravity. When Mark Hamilton's dreams of Ivy League glory were dashed, his world took an unexpected and ultimately catastrophic turn. Cast adrift from the iron grip of his family's academic ambitions, he enrolled in a prestigious art school in New York, a haven for misfits, rebels, and creative prodigies. On the surface, it was an environment where eccentricity was celebrated and boundaries were stretched. Yet for Mark, it became the crucible in which all his burgeoning obsessions and inner turbulence began to ferment out of control. Art school in the late 1980s crackled with a wild, transgressive energy. Paint-splattered studios throbbed with experimental jazz and the scent of linseed oil, while corridors buzzed with students ranting about meaning, politics, and aesthetics. The city's roiling undercurrents of danger and possibility were a constant backdrop. Graffiti-covered subways, shadowy alleys, and an omnipresent sense that anything could happen at any hour. For many, this was freedom. For Mark, it was fuel for the strange darkness within him. At first he tried to fit in, hiding his social awkwardness behind a camera lens and spending hours photographing city life, abandoned playgrounds, strangers in rain, the incongruous collision of wealth and want. Professors saw technical brilliance in his work but noticed his tendency to linger, sometimes for hours, in the darkest corners of the school's library or silently stalking the halls after midnight. While classmates debated postmodernism or critiqued each other's self-portraits, Mark's notebooks filled with increasingly bizarre sketches and cryptic writings, fractured anatomies, warped dolls, grotesque faces leering from the margins. It wasn't long before his obsessions became apparent. Mark developed a fixation on his female peers, often watching them from a distance in ways that made some uneasy. What began as candid street photography slipped into secretive surveillance, blurry photos taken through windows, hours spent following unsuspecting women from school to their apartments, documenting the routines of strangers as though their lives were specimens for study. The internet as we know it didn't exist, but Mark became a library regular in the seediest magazine stores, collecting Japanese animation and underground pornography with an intensity others found unsettling. His room, once neat, became crowded with tapes, photo negatives, and disturbing sketches, his private, festering universe. Professors noticed the shift. His portfolio grew darker and more explicit. What had once been odd was now openly troubling. One particularly controversial piece, A series of manipulated photographs resembling scenes of abduction and fear sparked heated debate within the faculty. Some saw it as avant-garde, a brutal mirror to the city's grit, but others whispered about Mark's detachment and the disturbing glee he seemed to take in creating these images. Rumors swirled about misconduct and a number of classmates began to avoid him, locking their doors when he was near. No longer tethered to parental expectations, Mark spiraled into isolation. Nights were spent wandering empty streets, staring into darkened shop windows or lost in the static of late-night television. Loneliness and rage fed his compulsions, while any former desire he had for genuine human connection withered away. In this season of his life, Mark's art became less an expression or critique, and more a mask for real-life predation, a place to plan, rehearse, and normalize the impulses that would soon spill into violence. Looking back, it's clear that art school was less a sanctuary and more the shadowed threshold between a broken childhood and the horrors yet to come. It was here, amid peeling murals and forgotten stairwells, that Mark Hamilton finally surrendered to the devouring darkness within. Family relationships. Memories of a villain. Mark Hamilton's relationship with his family was a twisted, fractured mosaic, a portrait that at first glance held the illusion of unity, but upon closer inspection revealed 1,000 jagged edges. While the Hamiltons projected the pristine image of a classic American dynasty complete with picture-perfect holidays and a gaudy gallery of generational portraits, Mark's personal experience cut through the facade like a cold wind. The only warmth he felt in the house had always come from his grandfather Arthur, whose presence was soft, understanding, and altogether different from the ambitious chill radiated by his parents. Growing up, Mark's connections to his immediate family, his father Charles, mother Evelyn, and 2 sisters, were tenuous at best, marked more by duty and silence than by affection. Charles, a titan in the media business, saw his family through the lens of reputation and legacy. Every dinner was another boardroom meeting, every accomplishment a line item on an invisible resume. Even praise felt transactional, like a stock tip passed along between CEOs. Evelyn, for her part, was the archetype of aristocratic reserve. Beautiful, elegant, she wore her expectations like diamond necklaces, and viewed Mark's eccentricities as flaws that could, with enough discipline, be polished away. His older sister Julia was tailored perfectly to the family script. Harvard-educated, always poised, applauded for her ambition. His younger sister Abigail, a shy but sharp girl, seemed to exist mostly on the periphery of Mark's field of vision, a ghostly shadow in family photographs. What made Mark truly an outsider among blood relatives was the unspoken contract of perfection. Every familial interaction, whether it was a holiday brunch under dazzling chandeliers or Sunday afternoon tennis on the private courts, contained a coded language. Your value is measured by your achievement is measured by what we can display to others. There were no heart-to-heart conversations about dreams, nightmares, or heartbreaks, no room for ordinary mistakes, let alone extraordinary ones. Love in the Hamilton household was conditional, a reward granted for upholding the family name, withheld for any whiff of embarrassment. So it was only natural that Mark clung to Arthur, his grandfather, who alone defied the rules of the house. Arthur was a relic of gentler times, one of the last people who could remember a Hamilton family that wasn't perched atop a media empire. He smoked a little too much, told off-color jokes, and listened to Mark with the patient attention of a man who had nothing left to prove. Sometimes he snuck Mark shortbread cookies before dinner or recounted stories of growing up in the city when hope wasn't something you inherited, but clawed your way toward. With Arthur, Mark let his defenses drop, even venturing to sketch quick portraits of him in pencil, capturing the soft folds around his eyes, the warmth of his smile. Those afternoons in Arthur's study, thick with the scent of tobacco and old books, were the only time Mark felt truly seen. But even Arthur's unconditional affection had its limits. He grew older and sicker, and by the summer of 1988, cancer had ravaged what little strength remained. The rest of the family barely noticed. The focus was on summer galas, business negotiations, college acceptances. When Arthur died, Mark felt a tidal wave of grief and rage swell within him, saturating every corner of his life. No one in the family knew how to comfort him, nor did they try. Evelyn simply pressed a gloved hand over Mark's shoulder at the funeral, whispered, "Be strong, darling," and turned away to greet a senator. Bereft of the only emotional anchor he'd ever had, Mark's world began to tilt into shadow. From that moment on, Mark's sense of family became almost spectral. He paid fleeting visits to the dinner table, ate most of his meals alone, and retreated for hours into the attic or his grandfather's empty study. The house, which once echoed with forced laughter and champagne promises, now rang hollow. His parents, frustrated by his withdrawal and increasingly erratic behavior, doubled down on their own routines and left him further adrift. Julia sailed into graduate school. Abigail grew quieter. Mark felt like he was haunting the house, a presence everyone tiptoed around but never directly acknowledged. The isolation began to rewire Mark's mind. As his loneliness deepened, unhealthy rituals took root. He obsessively preserved objects that belonged to his grandfather: cufflinks, handkerchiefs, a battered wristwatch, even a half-used bottle of cologne. Eventually, in a moment of desperate longing for closeness, Mark did the unthinkable. He kept a small portion of Arthur's ashes, hidden in a locket. One night, in an effort to feel his grandfather inside him, he swallowed a tiny amount. It was an act both profoundly disturbing and oddly logical in the context of his spiraling psyche. If he could not be loved by his family, perhaps he could carry the only love he'd ever known within himself forever. Mark's obsession with remembrance grew darker with time. He began conducting mock conversations with his grandfather in the dead of night, shutting the curtains and whispering secrets into the shadows. Sometimes he played back recordings of Arthur's voice on an old tape deck, letting the croaky wisdom seep through the walls. These rituals served as both solace and poison, feeding his isolation while convincing him that the rest of his family would never understand him. By the winter of '88, his behavior was so unsettled that even the loyal household staff, many of whom had watched him grow from an odd, quiet child into a reclusive, intense young man, began to gossip. Some said he spoke to ghosts. Others swore they'd seen him touch family portraits only to recoil, as if burned. Charles and Evelyn, desperate to avoid scandal, scheduled expensive therapy appointments, but Mark refused to attend. Any remaining bridges between them were quietly set ablaze. Worse yet, his memory of Arthur became a twisted talisman, a filter through which every family slight was magnified. He began to keep a secret diary, chronicling perceived betrayals, and cataloging the petty cruelties suffered at the hands of his parents and siblings. An overheard insult, a cold glance at breakfast, the laughter that bubbled up after he tripped on the tennis court. Mark's mind became a hall of mirrors, every reflection more warped, every remembered injury more poisonous. He started to believe he was owed something, for all the years of neglect, the public shaming, the private sorrow. A simmering resentment curdled into quiet, abiding hatred. Years later, police would discover meticulous notes, faded photographs, and locks of hair, all hidden in the attic, a private shrine to pain and remembrance. Mark's family, when interviewed, struggled to reconcile the polite, subdued boy they remembered with the predator he had become. They pointed to his adolescence as a period of growing distance, but few could recall reaching out, or what comfort, if any, they had offered. In the sickening wake of his crimes, the Hamilton name, once a byword for power and respectability, became synonymous with tragedy, shame, and the darkest end of privilege. Ultimately, Mark's relationship with his family was both the seed and the soil of his undoing. Their impossible expectations, emotional neglect, and spiritual poverty fostered a loneliness so absolute that, when paired with grief, it became monstrous. His memory of his grandfather, once a source of strength, twisted into a macabre relic, at once comforting and damning. As Mark lost his place in the family, he found a new kinship in obsession and eventually, destruction, the final, terrible legacy of his lineage. Early criminal cases. A bloody summer. As summer 1988 unfurled across New York City, its oppressive heat hung heavy in the air. But it was dread, not humidity, that truly seeped into every shadow. This was the season Mark Hamilton's monstrous legacy began, each crime not just an isolated horror, but a shockwave that reverberated across boroughs, neighborhoods, and the broken hearts of families. His first acts of violence were like splinters under the skin of the city, small at first, nearly invisible to the wider public, and then impossible to ignore as a pattern formed. Mark, with a lifetime of silent grievance, isolation, and churning obsessions, viewed the city with a predatory gaze that most could never imagine. The transition from internal fantasy to external horror was chillingly methodical. Each step, from planning to execution, was informed by a lifetime spent watching unnoticed and feeling untouched. For him, surveillance wasn't just about gathering material as an artist or a voyeur, but about claiming a sense of power in a world that had always made him feel small. That summer, the first victim was Mary Connor, a bright, wide-eyed girl just 6 years old. She lived in a modest apartment in the Lower East Side with her mother, far from the rarefied world Mark had come from. Her disappearance was almost cinematic in its quiet terror. A brief moment of distraction at a playground, a vanishing act in broad daylight. What the police didn't know, but Mark did intimately, was how easy it was to blend into the chaos of city life, to slip through the cracks as just another face in the crowd. Mark's approach was frighteningly calculated. He used charm, not the warm, dazzling kind, but the awkward politeness of someone who had long been ignored. He carried himself with an innocence that disarmed the wary just long enough for opportunity to strike. Behind the smile, though, lay an utter lack of empathy and a meticulous desire to instill fear. Mary was lured by promises of a stray kitten, perhaps, or an offer to help carry groceries. Within hours, her absence became a police bulletin, then a neighborhood panic, and before nightfall, a citywide crisis. It wasn't just the violence itself that set Mark apart. It was the aftermath. His acts were punctuated by sinister trophies and communications, as if he needed recognition for what he had done. He sent Mary's family fragments of her clothing, wrapped with chillingly polite handwritten notes that referenced details only someone close to her could know. These weren't taunts for entertainment. They were his way of inserting himself into the grief and hysteria he'd created, demanding not only to be feared, but also to be acknowledged. The second case came just weeks later. 7-year-old Alicia Figueroa, who vanished on her way from a summer reading class. Mark had watched her for weeks, noting routines, mapping the rhythm of her daily walk, studying her mother's work schedule and which streets were busiest at different times of day. Alicia's body was discovered 2 days later, carefully posed in an abandoned lot decorated with objects she'd treasured, a hair ribbon, a plastic bracelet, set out like exhibits in one of Mark's childhood art projects. For the detectives working the case, the crime scene read like a cryptic confession, as if Mark was telling the world, "Look at me, try to decipher me. You can't." By mid-July, a third child, 5-year-old Thomas Nguyen, went missing within blocks of the previous cases. This time, Mark shifted tactics, further confounding investigators. He exploited the chaos already gripping the city, mimicking the movements of school staff to win the trust of children and parents alike. The abduction took place in broad daylight, in front of shops and chattering strangers. It was as if Mark had become emboldened by his own myth, feeding off the swirl of speculation he'd created. News reports speculated about a deranged loner or a criminal gang. No one yet grasped that this was the work of a single, meticulous predator. With Thomas, Mark left behind another signature, a Polaroid photo mailed to the local precinct, showing the boy's favorite toy truck resting on a park bench. Inside the envelope, a second, more chilling note: "The city is too busy to notice what it's lost." That line became the focus of every headline, an emblem of parental fear, civic outrage, and the mounting pressure on police. The final child that summer was Emily Rivera, age 4. Her abduction was the most brazen. Mark snatched her from the stoop of her family's brownstone during a humid August afternoon. This time he didn't bother with pretense or subterfuge. Driven by an escalating compulsion, his actions had become reckless. Emily's parents, away on a quick errand, returned to sirens, swarming neighbors, and the gut-punch realization that their daughter had vanished in a matter of minutes. As with the earlier cases, Mark escalated the terror by sending not only keepsakes, but also a cassette recording of Emily's voice, pieced together from snippets recorded during the abduction, delivered with a note that chilled investigators: "I have your happiness in my pocket." Police frantically combed through surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and city records. The city teetered between heartache and hysteria, suspicion slicing through once friendly neighborhoods. What unified the cases wasn't just the brutality, but the psychological warfare Mark unleashed. He was less a criminal in the traditional sense, more a phantom who knew how to manipulate misery itself as his real weapon. Behind the scenes, the NYPD struggled to connect the dots. Mark left just enough variation at each crime scene to confuse profiler theories, switching patterns, times of day, and victim profiles within a narrow age range. To the seasoned detectives, it was both infuriating and terrifying. They were dealing with someone who understood not only the mechanisms of violence but the psychology of investigation and public response. The task force doubled in size, and parents across the city braced themselves each morning, half expecting to see another smiling child's face above the fold on the front page. Meanwhile, Mark returned to his own routines, blending seamlessly into city crowds, visiting newsstands to watch coverage of his deeds, and feeding off the citywide uproar. The crimes took a visible toll on him. His art grew darker, more violent, his presence at the art academy more fleeting and erratic. But the greater the chaos he created outside, the more powerful he felt inside. A cruel inversion of the powerlessness he'd lived with his entire life. By the end of summer, Mark's string of atrocities cast a shadow that New York would never quite shake. His first 4 cases in 1988 redefined fear for a generation and etched his moniker, the Otaku Butcher, deep into the city's dark folklore. The city that prided itself on never sleeping became a place where parents peeked through blinds after sunset, where trust was withdrawn even from the most familiar faces, and where an unseen predator seemed always just beyond the next intersection. Looking back, those summer months stand as an unhealing wound in the city's history. Mark Hamilton's crimes weren't just about taking lives, they were about stealing peace, fragmenting communities, and leaving a legacy of unanswered questions and aching grief. The bloody summer of 1988 marked not only the end of innocence for many New Yorkers, but also the beginning of an obsessive citywide manhunt that would dominate headlines and haunt dreams for years to come. A provocation from the darkness. In the aftermath of the grisly crimes that stained the streets of New York, the city desperately hoped for a period of silence, a lull in which investigators could catch up and families could grieve. But Mark Hamilton never intended to fade quietly into the shadows. Instead, what followed became as chilling, if not more so, than the murders themselves. The so-called Otaku Butcher embarked on a new campaign designed to keep the city in a constant state of agitation. He became a phantom presence, not only through the fear he instilled, but also in the way he manipulated the media and law enforcement with a series of calculated taunts, sent directly from the heart of darkness. It started with a single, almost elegant envelope addressed to the NYPD task force lead. No return address, just a black wax seal impressed with the outline of an insect, an eerily intimate callback to details known only to the police and the killer. Inside, the letter was typewritten, the words carefully chosen, devoid of errors. The tone dripped with icy detachment, as if the writer were narrating a chess game rather than a spree of human tragedy. He referred to his victims as lost players and dubbed himself the director of the summer tragedy. The sense of theatricality was hard to ignore. He wasn't just confessing, he was performing for an audience he both feared and depended on. From then on, these missives became routine. Some were short, taunting, almost flippant, as if he derived pleasure from baiting the very people tasked with ending his terror. Others sprawled for pages, dissecting police press conferences. "I see you stuttering through my lines, Detective Morgan. Does the spotlight hurt?" Analyzing newspaper coverage or reciting warped poems about loneliness and shadows. The letters would arrive at precincts, newspapers, and even on the doorsteps of the families he had already devastated. The most infamous one arrived with a pressed daisy, a ghoulish postscript, a flower for every memory you'll never reclaim. What set these communications apart wasn't just their cold eloquence, but the disturbing insight they offered into Mark's psyche. Despite the meticulous detachment, each letter leaked a desperate hunger for recognition, a need to be understood, or at least remembered even as a monster. He made references to obscure literature, scattered Japanese phrases, a nod to the cartoon obsessions the media later fixated on, and included riddles about the next target. Psychologists and profilers combed through each passage, debating whether the killer was genuinely brilliant or simply a collector of borrowed aesthetics. Did he want to be caught, or did he simply want to prove he was always a step ahead? For detectives, the taunts were both a curse and a clue. Sometimes he revealed case details never released to the public. He would mention the exact color of a victim's hair ribbon, the brand of chalk found on a sidewalk, or recount interactions with bystanders in chilling photographic detail. With each new message, police had to grapple with their own failures splashed across headlines. And the press, sensing the public's addiction to fear, played along, printing excerpts, inviting experts to decode the madness, feeding a citywide atmosphere of paranoia. Some letters contained hand-drawn sketches mimicking crime scene layouts. Others included Polaroids, shadowy and indecipherable, of toys scattered on playgrounds or of seemingly random city corners. These images became urban legends. Was that the spot of the next attack, or a reference to a horror already committed? The smallest clues sent parents scrambling, while would-be sleuths mapped the patterns, hunting for meaning in every cryptic line. The killer seemed to relish the ripple effect. His words alone could clear a park or fill it with panicked onlookers by evening. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't just the authorities or the victims' relatives who received these cruel provocations. Letters began arriving at television newsrooms, popular talk show hosts, Even art critics who had panned his earlier photography exhibits, somehow the killer remembered every slight from his artistic past. Each message was crafted for its audience, filled with mock sympathy, stinging condescension, or veiled threats wrapped in elaborate metaphors. There was a grotesque artistry to his campaign. For Mark, the city was a stage, and the fear he sowed was as much his creation as any photograph or sculpture he had ever made at art school. Most chilling were the letters sent directly to grieving families. In one notorious instance, the envelope simply read, "From the other side of the playground." Inside was a neatly folded paper, the familiar cartoon mascot from a beloved TV show drawn in the margins. The note began, "Do you remember her favorite song?" followed by cryptic lyrics and a claim that their daughter danced through the city lights one last time. Far from closure, these letters reopened wounds, inflicting a fresh private agony upon households already drowning in loss. It became clear that for Mark Hamilton, communication was not just an afterthought. It was as integral to his process as the crimes themselves. The act of writing, of orchestrating whole communities' fright, gave him a sense of control and omnipresence that eluded him in every other sphere of life. His victims, alive or dead, were props in an ongoing pageant of domination over the city's psyche. And as summer waned and autumn crept in, his letters only grew in frequency and boldness. In one memorable episode, after the mayor went on television to declare the city united against evil, a package arrived at City Hall itself. Inside, a fractured mirror, the mayor's own press photo taped to the broken glass, and a note reading, "Evil hides in reflection, not in darkness." The gesture was both a mockery of civic unity and a warning, and it rattled everyone from city councilmen to crossing guards. Mark's taunts were deliberately theatrical. He wanted both to humiliate those in power and to remind ordinary citizens that, ultimately, true safety was a fiction. Law enforcement specialists tried a variety of responses. At first, they withheld many letters from the press, fearing public panic or the risk of copycats. But as the letters grew more public and personalized, it became impossible to suppress them. Every family had their own horror story, every street corner its own rumor, and at the heart of all the whispering was the certainty that the killer could be anywhere, see anyone, reach into any home with a single postmarked note. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of this correspondence was its lasting impact on the civic psyche. Decades later, archived newsreels and collections of the original letters are still studied in criminal psychology classes. The pale envelopes, the clinical typing, the taunting signatures, all remain an eerie artifact of how terror can be engineered, not just through violence but through the written word itself. Hamilton built himself into an omnipresent shadow, not just with the bodies he left behind but by chaining the city to his message, one missive at a time. Fear reaches its peak. By the time the public realized the Otaku butcher's reign of terror was more than just a string of isolated tragedies, New York City found itself slipping into the grip of an unprecedented collective paranoia. The city, known for its resilience and brash self-assurance, had been transformed almost overnight into an anxious, trembling version of itself. As summer dragged on, long, hot, and restless, the fear of the unknown became a tangible, ever-present force shaping the daily life of everyone from Wall Street executives to corner store clerks. In neighborhoods that once thrived on their bustling community energy, playgrounds emptied out and curfews appeared overnight. Conversations between neighbors quickly turned from gossip to strategic planning. Advice swapped urgently about which streets to avoid, who could be trusted to watch the children, and how to spot anything off in the daily routine. For parents, the ordinary rituals of childhood suddenly felt fraught with risks that could no longer be rationalized away. The panic was especially palpable for the city's children and teenagers. With each new headline, parents became more restrictive, forbidding trips to friends' houses or solo journeys to school. Summer camps saw record cancellations, police officers walked school perimeters in broad daylight, and local shopkeepers watched every unfamiliar face with wary suspicion. This was not just a city on alert, it was a metropolis fundamentally uncertain about its own safety, finding monsters in every shadow and question marks in every passing glance. A tide of anonymous tips and emergency calls poured into the NYPD. Any man idling near a playground drew silent condemnation, if not an outright police search. Paranoia didn't just scrape away at trust in strangers, it gnawed at the connective tissue of the entire community. Suddenly, lifelong friends eyed each other with wariness, while longtime neighbors whispered about past oddities, a forgotten argument, an overly strict parent, a shadow glimpsed late at night. Media coverage, hungry for every lurid detail, fueled the fires of hysteria. Talk radio hosted round-the-clock speculation and self-styled vigilante groups sprang up, promising to defend neighborhoods where they felt the police had failed. City officials tried desperately to project calm, even rolling out plans for increased patrols, neighborhood watch seminars and press conferences with carefully chosen sound bites. But every reassurance was drowned out by the onslaught of new evidence, cryptic letters from the killer, and the simple fact that no one had been caught. Every new incident, hoax, or rumor was seized upon by an audience desperate for answers, and desperate too for someone specific to blame. The quest for the killer warped into a hunt for any perceived threat, and in the process, the fabric of the city itself began to show strain. For children, the world shifted overnight from limitless adventure to a carefully mapped landscape of rules, locks, and surveillance. The effect on civic institutions was overwhelming. Schools revamped security plans, with metal detectors and ID checks for anyone entering the building. Households invested in more robust locks, security systems, and even guard dogs for the first time. Religious leaders organized community vigils, each one a somber ceremony straining to reignite a sense of hope and solidarity. City Hall turned into a fortress. Social workers and counselors gave urgent talks about trauma and resilience, but in truth, no guidebook existed for this kind of civic wound. Most painful of all was the toll on families of past and potential victims. For them, the city's fear was a reflection of their intimate, everyday horror, enduring perpetual grief, laced with guilt that they might have done something, anything, to prevent disaster. Some families moved away, trying to outrun the ghost of tragedy and find peace in places less haunted by headlines. Others lobbied for harsher criminal penalties, faster response protocols, and greater transparency from the NYPD, becoming reluctant activists pressed into the public eye by sheer anguish. And beneath it all, a sense of injustice simmered. The city's poor and immigrant communities, already used to being underserved, felt intensified scrutiny and suspicion. Rumors flourished about gangs, outsiders, or those perceived as different, exacerbating old prejudices in a new, more toxic form. Even as the threat was, ironically, the work of a single predator, the scapegoating cast a cloud over countless innocent lives, reinforcing the sense that terror separated New York not just along lines of safety, but of trust and belonging. Even the rituals of comfort, watching late-night television, summer festivals, block parties, became tinged with dread. News channels ran round-the-clock updates and special programming dissecting the Otaku butcher case, their graphic reenactments and frantic analyst debates blurring the line between news and urban myth. Psychics claimed to sense the killer's aura. Radio call-ins were flooded with confessions, accusations, stories of ordinary encounters now painted with menace. For police and city leadership, the mounting terror bred its own desperate measures. Overwhelmed precincts brought in federal agents and profilers, while mayors and governors postured for the cameras, promising swift justice and declaring moral crusades. Temporary pacts between rival politicians were forged and then shattered, each trying to present themselves as the true defender of the city. All the while, Mark Hamilton remained anonymous and at large, his letters and taunts keeping the city's emotional wounds open for all to see. By August's end, the city seemed poised on a knife's edge. All it would have taken was a single spark, a mistaken identity, a flash of mob panic, another letter from Hamilton, for the mounting tension to spill over into chaos. In cafes, subways, and churches, the question on everyone's lips was no longer just who, or when, but whether any sense of normalcy could ever return. The fear Hamilton conjured was no longer just about the killer, but about what the city itself was capable of becoming in darkness. The psychological impact of that summer would echo through the city for decades. Parents raised a generation of children with a different sense of vigilance, kids who learned to distrust not only strangers, but the very environment they inhabited. The trauma did not simply fade with the passage of time or paperwork, or the eventual capture of the Otaku butcher. It shaped the collective psyche, leaving behind a version of New York that was at once more careful and less innocent, more resilient, but also quietly scarred. In retrospect, the apex of fear that defined that summer stands as an inflection point in the city's modern history. Block by block, apartment by apartment, New Yorkers realized just how fragile their everyday security could be. That lesson, perhaps even more than the crimes themselves, is the legacy that haunted the city most profoundly. The shadow cast by the Otaku butcher lingered, not just over the scenes of his crimes, but in the cautious way laughter returned to playgrounds, in the steely glances exchanged between strangers, and in every parent's hand gripping their child's just a little tighter when crossing the street at dusk. The final case and an end for the murderer. By the summer of 1989, New York City was a city on tiptoe, every breath a shallow gasp, every shadow a potential threat. The bloodstains of previous summers had not dried on the city's collective memory, and rumors churned through neighborhoods with a feverish, paranoid energy. The Otaku butcher had gone quiet after his initial spree, leading many to believe he had either left town, been institutionalized, or laid to rest in some anonymous grave. As weeks crawled by, families dared to let their guard drop, if only for the sake of sanity. But Mark Hamilton, whose hunger for power and control had escalated with every passing crime, was far from finished. The sense of omnipotence, the intoxicating feeling that only he understood the secret rules of this deadly game, was addictive. Living in the midst of chaos he created, blending into the city's anonymous rhythm by day, Mark was plotting what would become both his most daring act and his ultimate undoing. The decision wasn't born of meticulous calculation, but of mounting desperation. Unlike his earlier meticulously staged abductions, this time Hamilton's compulsion was raw and urgent. The city was already on high alert. Law enforcement's dragnet had grown tighter, its task force swelling with federal consultants, profilers, and undercover agents. Roads around parks were patrolled day and night. Still, compulsion trumped logic. Mark wanted to prove his dominance over a city that could barely breathe without whispering his name. He wanted to etch his infamy deeper. One more postcard from the void, one final taunt before his real identity was at risk. It was a sweltering July afternoon when fate, pride, and paranoia collided in Central Park. It started innocuously enough. Two sisters, ages 11 and 9, picnicking with their father on a bright green blanket in a shady corner near the turtle pond. Like every New York family that summer, they followed a strict security ritual. Always together, always watched. But joy, after months of tension, has a way of dulling caution. For just a moment their father turned to pack away the remains of lunch. It was enough. From a distance, Mark observed, blending in with summer crowds of joggers, sunbathers, and children darting in and out of playgrounds. Unlike other times, his approach was brash, reckless. Instead of calculated coaxing or careful surveillance, he moved quickly, a fleeting opportunity, seized almost on instinct. His eyes locked onto the two sisters as they wandered a few yards out of their father's immediate reach. The attack was terrifyingly swift. Mark lunged, seizing both girls and attempting to drag them into a thicket of dense shrubbery, shielded from the main path. One of the sisters, the elder, had a moment of startling presence of mind. She screamed, a guttural primal sound carried on the hot summer air. The commotion was so sudden and jarring that several bystanders froze, but the sister twisted from Mark's grip, kicked his shin with all her strength, and broke free. She sprinted for her father, her shrieks piercing the illusion of safety that still lingered over the park. The minutes that followed felt stretched, each heartbeat a world away, as the scene dissolved into chaos. Their father, wide-eyed with terror, bolted toward the shrubs. Mark, realizing he had lost the element of surprise, released the younger sister. She in turn dashed after her sister toward their father's arms. What Mark did next spoke volumes about his mental state. Instead of disappearing into the underbrush or slipping away as he had so many times before, he hesitated. For one wild moment he seemed poised to try again, to snatch one of the girls or lunge at their father, but a wall of shouts, footsteps, and then the shrill blast of a police whistle shattered any such hope. Almost instantly, Central Park's tranquility exploded into bedlam. Park-goers converged with cell phones and pepper spray drawn, while two undercover officers on bike patrol, coincidentally within earshot, raced to the site. Mark ran, weaving through tourists, leaping low fences, his heart slamming in his chest. He was fast but no longer invisible. Adrenaline, not calculation, guided each move. The sisters' cries echoed down the mall as their father attempted to flag down anyone in uniform. The pursuit stretched across several city blocks. Mark bolted from the park onto 72nd Street, dodging cabs and nearly colliding with a delivery truck. The police, now in pursuit with sirens screaming, had both a physical description and a direction of travel. Onlookers gawked, some giving chase, others frantically relaying details to the nearest officer. Mark's panic, after so many years of careful anonymity, betrayed him. He was not the omniscient puppet master now, but a desperate figure cornered by his own myth. As he cut through alleyways and back streets, Mark tossed aside a baseball cap and windbreaker, his usual attempt to blend into the crowd, but his face was now burned into the minds of dozens of witnesses. He ducked into a small bodega, hoping to escape through the rear exit, but the proprietor, alarmed by his frantic demeanor, blocked the door and shouted for help. Sirens wailed nearer. Mark, for the first time, found himself with nowhere to run. In a last burst of panicked energy, he attempted to force his way past, scattering merchandise and sending the bodega's bell clanging. Two plainclothes officers tackled him just as he reached the threshold. Mark fought back savagely, biting, clawing, and shrieking, but the fight left him quickly, overwhelmed by a dozen hands as backup arrived. The arrest was as public and theatrical as the crimes that had haunted the city for over a year. As officers cuffed Mark, dozens of onlookers stared in disbelief, cell phones raised, recording the end of a nightmare. The sisters were soon reunited with their father, shaking but unharmed, while Mark Hamilton, his clothes torn, blood drying at the corner of his mouth, eyes wild, was shoved into the back of a squad car. The headlines wrote themselves, "Butcher of New York caught in daylight drama." Yet, even as relief rippled through the city, there were few easy answers. Mark's arrest triggered a tidal wave of public reaction. Anger, disbelief, and finally, mourning for the innocents lost. Once his identity was confirmed, police raided his apartment, uncovering a grotesque archive of thousands of videotapes, drawings, newspaper clippings, and objects stolen from victims. The criminal investigation that followed was one of the most exhaustive in New York City history. The evidence, meticulously cataloged and analyzed, laid bare the full extent of Mark's depravity. Hours of footage and stacks of notes revealed an obsession not just with his crimes, but with their aftermath. He tracked every development, even keeping a collection of his own letters and published newspaper photos. He had constructed dioramas and mood boards detailing planned attacks, blending his artistic skills with a chilling capacity for violence. Detectives spent months cross-referencing his trophies to cold cases, agonizing over the possibility of more unknown victims. Mark Hamilton's capture became a media spectacle. For weeks, TV trucks clogged streets outside the police precinct. News anchors speculated wildly about motives, mental illness, and the chilling split between his apparently ordinary life and horrific secret self. His once proud family, now pariahs, went into hiding. Every known associate, classmates from art school, former neighbors, even a handful of teachers, were interrogated, their lives upended by proximity to the most infamous killer in recent memory. The city erupted in a complex mix of outrage and relief. Vigil after vigil filled churches and parks, each one an imperfect attempt to wrest back a sense of community stolen by years of fear. The police, battered by months of criticism and doubt, were lauded for their persistence, but haunted by the scale and cruelty of the case. At the victims' funerals, parents wept not just for their children, but for the city's irretrievable peace. Behind bars, Mark Hamilton underwent endless rounds of psychiatric examinations and interviews with criminal profilers. Initial evaluations revealed not only clear signs of personality disorder, narcissism, profound detachment, lack of empathy, but also hinted at deeper, unresolved trauma. He oscillated between chilling moments of clarity and fits of wild agitation, sometimes waxing poetic about his creations, other times stone silent. He never expressed remorse. Instead, he seemed preoccupied with how he would be remembered, as an artist, a scorned outcast, or America's latest monster. To many who studied him, Mark was the perfect embodiment of the modern American boogeyman, equal parts product of a privileged but loveless upbringing and his own pathological choices. Through a highly publicized trial, Mark Hamilton was ultimately convicted on multiple counts, with the death penalty as the final sentence. The trial itself became theater. The prosecution methodically displaying every artifact, family members testifying in turn, psychiatrists offering conflicting diagnoses. The defense vainly argued for mental illness, but the chilling detail and premeditation of his crimes weighed heavily on the jury. Even in sentencing, Mark was unrepentant, offering only cryptic comments about beauty and darkness. The aftermath stretched beyond the prison walls. The Hamilton family's once unassailable legacy crumbled, businesses shuttered, estates sold, fortunes diverted to cover mounting legal fees and security measures just to keep their names out of the papers. Former colleagues and friends broke ties, siblings changed their last names. New legislation and citywide reforms followed, tightening safety protocols in public spaces, reforming procedures around missing children, and investing in trauma counseling for affected communities. The press, ever hungry, dissected every nuance of the case for years, turning Mark's story into cautionary tales and classroom study material. Mark Hamilton's final act, his desperate attempt in Central Park, remains to this day a grim parable of how terror can unravel not just the lives of its immediate victims, but the very fabric of an entire city. For New Yorkers who remember that era, the echoes of those sirens, the pounding apprehension beneath summer sunlight linger still. The monster, once a ghost, became all too real. His end was not just the capture of a criminal, but a solemn reckoning, a warning of how darkness left unchecked and unseen can erupt without warning, even on the brightest day. The dark legend and the downfall of the Klan. From the very moment Mark Hamilton's identity was exposed to the world, the Hamilton family went from the zenith of American respectability to the very depths of infamy, a transformation as swift as it was irreversible. The once proud dynasty that had presided over media boardrooms, charity galas, and society's most exclusive circles suddenly became the subject of both pity and public scorn. What had begun with whispers in the halls of Yale and Harvard, rumors that something had gone awry beneath the polished surface, exploded into a national spectacle. Every headline, every news anchor, every late-night show fixated not just on Mark, but on the fatal cracks running through an American aristocracy undone by its own secrets. In the first chaotic weeks after Mark's arrest, the family name was torn apart with clinical efficiency by the media. Reporters unearthed every detail of their personal lives, Charles Hamilton's investment strategies, Evelyn's rumored affairs, Julia's charitable foundations, even young Abigail's struggles in boarding school. Paparazzi camped on the estate's grand front lawns, catching desperate glances behind drawn curtains. Tabloids called them everything from America's Nightfall Family to the house that bred a monster. Rumor mongers blamed everything from inbreeding to occult involvement, as if the public needed supernatural explanations for a real-world horror. The relentless exposure destroyed what little privacy the Hamiltons had left, magnifying every past mistake into a fresh scandal. The family fortune, once the pride and shield of the Hamiltons, crumbled with shocking speed. Corporate partners cut ties as soon as the story became uncontainable. Major advertisers threatened boycotts, and board members from the Hamilton media empire moved swiftly to distance themselves, forcing Charles out of his CEO seat in a closed-door coup. The Hamilton name, for decades a synonym for legitimacy, was now a liability. Stocks plummeted, lawsuits poured in, and creditors began circling like sharks. Even family friends, those stalwart fixtures of the cocktail circuit, stopped returning calls. As legal bills mounted, it became clear the dynasty would not weather the storm. The grand estate was quietly listed with a realtor, prized artworks put up for auction. In what felt like poetic justice to some and cruel fate to others, the trophies of a family's success became mere commodities, sold off to pay the costs of another's sins. Emotionally, the impact was even more devastating. At the height of the scandal, Charles and Evelyn Hamilton became virtual prisoners inside their own home. Formerly regal and commanding, Charles aged 20 years and months, his posture sagging as cronies, lawyers, and creditors battered down his resolve. Evelyn, long the ice queen of New York's charity circuit, simply vanished. Some said she took to a private clinic overseas, others that she retreated upstate, living under an assumed name, unwilling to face the avalanche of whispers. For their children, the collapse felt like both punishment and exile, a banishment from the only world they'd ever known. Julia resigned from every philanthropic board, unable to escape the shadow trailing her last name. Abigail, already fragile, withdrew completely, disappearing from social life and even from her friends' concern. The Hamilton staff, maids, drivers, tutors, also felt the seismic shock. Many lost their jobs overnight as the estate downsized, and those who stayed endured the daily humiliation of reporters scrounging for any scrap of gossip. Whispers spread through servant circles. What had they seen or heard all those years ago that now seemed ominous? Were there signs they missed, oddities in Mark's behavior, strange requests, the cold silences at dinner, that should have served as warnings? Many carried secret shame, unable to reconcile their kindness toward the peculiar boy they'd once humored with the terror he left behind. The revelations about Mark's secret life amplified the tragedy to gothic proportions. The discovery of his hidden collection, thousands of Japanese animation tapes, home-edited videos, grotesque art projects, carefully preserved newspaper articles about his own crimes, became the stuff of legend. The press, in its appetite for a singular narrative, leaned into the otaku butcher persona. Headlines shouted about anime obsession gone wrong as though a taste in cartoons could explain a soul's descent into darkness. Every article added a new lurid twist, an anonymous psychiatrist speculating about multiple personalities, a former classmate recalling Mark's fascination with death, a psychologist pointing to his diary as the Rosetta Stone of American psychopathy. For the public, the details were fuel for both fascination and fear, a cautionary tale wrapped in sensationalist packaging. Even Mark's courtroom appearances contributed to the Hamilton downfall. Despite his defense team's last-ditch efforts to plead insanity or childhood trauma, the court sessions became public morality plays, pitting nature against nurture, individual evil against institutional failure. Spectators, journalists, and true crime fanatics packed the benches, all eager to witness the Hamilton legacy unravel in real time. When Mark was finally sentenced to death for his crimes, the courtroom seemed to sigh in collective relief, but the damage to the family was already permanent. No amount of closure could erase the inferno that had consumed their standing. With the family decimated, the estate shattered, and the name Hamilton all but erased from polite society, the aftermath dragged on, more ghostly and low-key but never quite fading. Rumors flourished about Charles dying penniless in a lonely apartment, or Evelyn living on pills and resentments in anonymity overseas. Some distant relatives attempted to change their surnames, hoping to escape the cross-generational humiliation. At social clubs and alumni reunions, people averted their eyes at the very mention of the Hamiltons, as if shame itself were contagious. But even as the dynasty dissolved, the Hamilton story morphed into a dark American fable. Documentaries, podcasts, and books probed the fall, from the family's gilded origins to its catastrophic demise. Conspiracy theories thrived in online forums. Was Mark's evil truly born of cold privilege and neglect, or was there something in the bloodline itself? The case inspired screenwriters and novelists, who drew on the saga as a warning about the dangers of detached ambition, unchecked power, and the darkness festering behind locked doors. The image of the Hamilton mansion, lights forever dimmed, gates rusting in summer fog, became a symbol not just of personal ruin, but of the way whole legacies can be devoured by secrets turned toxic. The family tragedy also had a wider resonance. Across the city, in places once enchanted by the Hamilton name, a kind of cultural haunting took root. Art galleries that once coveted their patronage now quietly redacted donor plaques. Schools removed family portraits. In business circles, no one spoke of the Hamilton touch. In fact, association was a liability. The surname, like a faded warning, lingered in whispered cautionary tales. Parents warning their children that money and pedigree alone could not shield them from the consequences of neglect or cruelty. For years after, social scientists would study the collapse, using it as a case study in everything from media ethics to the psychology of shame. The question, how much did the Hamiltons know, became a refrain in talk shows and opinion columns, a way to rehash blame and sublimate collective anxieties about evil lurking in privileged places. For some, there was satisfaction in watching the mighty brought low, an idea so fundamental to the American mythos. For others, there was only sorrow, a reminder that behind every headline, every legend are ordinary people ground down by the machinery of notoriety. In the end, the Hamilton dynasty did not dissolve in a blaze of retribution, but in a slow, spectral unraveling, grandeur decaying into regret, their triumphs subsumed by a story no one wanted to inherit. The disgrace did not just belong to Mark, nor even to his immediate family. It echoed through generations, transforming a proud name into a ghost haunting the margins of memory and American folklore. The echoes of their fall serve as a dark reflection, an enduring legend about the limits of privilege, the destructive power of secrets, and the impossibility of truly escaping the past. Lingering ghost. Even after the Otaku butcher's capture, conviction, and eventual death, the shadow Mark Hamilton cast over New York and his own lineage refused to dissipate. The passage of time didn't erase the phantom sting left in the wake of each violent act. Instead, the city and its people found themselves waking again and again to echoes and ripples of fear, sorrow, and unresolved questions. The haunting wasn't confined to dimly lit alleys or distant memories. It took up permanent residence in the very architecture of everyday life, quietly reshaping the urban psyche and the soul of a wounded family. Hamilton's grave, a nondescript marker in a prison yard, stands as both tombstone and cautionary tale. Despite his anonymity in death, the legacy of terror bled into collective consciousness, taboo and fascination collided at the intersection where his myth was born. The tale of the Otaku butcher became more than a true crime story. It festered as urban legend, passed down in whispered warnings between generations, becoming shorthand for a darkness that could bubble up from the most ordinary of homes. Libraries, police academy lecture halls, and late-night talk shows returned to his case not for closure, but to dissect what had gone so horribly wrong. Was it the school system, the family, the city itself? Did evil always look like a stranger, or could it wear the familiar mask of the boy next door? Within the Hamilton family, the ghost demanded a more intimate reckoning. Charles and Evelyn, once the toast of high society, found themselves not only bankrupt but stigmatized. Neither could escape the relentless churn of tabloids or the venom of former friends who eagerly recast the family's successes as signs of hidden rot. Their home, once a symbol of wealth and perfect lineage, became a mausoleum to loss. Julia and Abigail, Mark's sisters, were both marked in different but permanent ways, one haunted by notoriety, the other by the quiet ache of anonymity, their futures forever tethered to horrors neither committed nor anticipated. Evelyn retreated into seclusion, Charles wandered through years of aimless exiles, each sibling finding their own means, healthy or otherwise, to distance themselves from both brother and past. For the broader New York community, Mark Hamilton's presence persisted in forms both subtle and overt. The playgrounds whose laughter once echoed unguarded now stood under a shroud of suspicion. Every parent wielded a sharper edge of vigilance. Annual remembrances for the victims brought families and survivors together, both to mourn and to steel themselves against the temptation to ever feel truly safe again. Some blocks erected small, quietly maintained memorials, bouquets refreshing faded plaques, colored ribbons twisting around rails, mothers gripping their children's hands with desperate gratitude as dusk crept in. The media's handling of the case left its own residue. Television specials, articles, and even documentaries sought not just to inform but to beckon viewers into the mind of the monster. Such coverage, exploitative at times, blurred the boundaries between fact and sensational fiction, ensuring that the Otaku butcher would remain both public boogeyman and private nightmare. The city's true crime circles continued to turn his name into trivia, even as survivors and family members pleaded for privacy, and yet archives swelled with every new theory, every reinterpretation, every disturbing drawing exhumed from Mark's abandoned storage lockers. Children who grew up during that era internalized a different set of rules, a behavioral caution passed down not just for safety, but as a response to the cruel unpredictability Hamilton personified. School curriculums adapted. Lessons about stranger danger, mental health, and reporting suspicious activity became standard. Psychologists identified a whole generation marked by subtle anxiety, an ambient wariness seeded by events they were too young to fully fathom at the time but would never entirely shake. New Yorkers, known for resilience and bravado, found themselves nursing a quieter brand of strength, one that acknowledged vulnerability but refused to let fear dictate every interaction. Law enforcement, too, bore scars invisible to public scrutiny. Detectives who chased Hamilton through those feverish summers carried the burden of missed clues and the guilt of victims not saved in time. The department underwent reform, task forces grew more specialized, communication with the public more strategic, and a weightier respect took hold for the toll such cases took on everyone involved. Police veterans told new recruits stories of Hamilton not just to frighten, but to impress upon them the crucial responsibility and humility their badges demanded. Yet for all the adaptation, remembrance, and reform, the most tenacious specter was the philosophical one. What do we do with evil that seems to evade explanation, a void that resists being filled with blame or policy responses? In private conversations over kitchen tables, in therapist offices, or in the cathartic afterglow of candlelight vigils, New Yorkers and Hamilton's surviving relatives wrestled with dilemmas of forgiveness, fate, and the limits of knowing another soul. Could a tragedy this senseless ever be understood? Should it be memorialized, cautioned against, or simply sealed away and forgotten? In the end, the phantom Mark Hamilton left behind wasn't just about lost innocence, shredded safety, or broken legacy. It was the quiet, undying reminder that darkness, once unleashed, seeps into the smallest cracks and lingers in the places we least expect. An empty hallway, the pause in a conversation, the nervous look exchanged between a parent and child at twilight. The city moves on as all cities must, but somewhere, whether in an untouched attic, a battered photo album, or the collective wariness of its people, his shadow will always flicker, just beyond the reach of the light.